They say that kindness, no matter how small, never disappears. It simply waits for the right moment to return. On a snowy Christmas Eve, one young woman's simple act of compassion toward a weary old man unlocked a secret buried for decades, a promise born from sacrifice and sealed by loyalty. This is not just a Christmas story, it is a legacy of kindness passed from father to daughter, from soldier to stranger. Stay with me, because what happened next will make you believe that even the smallest gesture can change the course of a lifetime. Don't forget to follow, like, and share if you've ever believed in the power of kindness. The diner smelled faintly of coffee and grease, its linoleum floor polished earlier that afternoon, yet already dulled by boots dragging in snow. Outside, Main Street lay nearly silent, the shop strung with twinkling, colored lights that flickered against the frozen glass. Inside, Grace Sullivan wiped down the counter for what felt like the 100th time. Christmas Eve in rural Idaho was never busy, but tonight the emptiness pressed heavier than usual. Most families were home by their firesides, exchanging gifts and laughter. Grace, 24, worked her part-time shift with a quiet ache inside her chest, still grieving the sudden loss of her father earlier in the year. The manager, Joe, hunched near the register, counting receipts with the impatience of a man desperate to close early. Only 2 customers lingered over cooling mugs of coffee, both too lost in their own solitude to notice the festive garlands taped along the windows. Grace tried to keep her mind from drifting to the apartment she shared with her mother, where a small, slightly crooked tree waited for her hands to finish decorating. She told herself she would be home soon enough. Then the bell above the door chimed. A rush of icy wind swept in as an elderly man stepped through. His coat was thin, the fabric frayed at the edges. Worn shoes left damp imprints across the floor. His silver hair, long enough to curl around his collar, shone against the dim light. For a moment, no one spoke. Joe looked up with a scowl. "We're closing in 15, he called out flatly, as though hoping the stranger would turn around and leave. The man paused but did not retreat. Something in his stillness, tired yet dignified, made Grace step forward. "I'll take care of him, Joe," she said softly. "It's Christmas Eve." Joe sighed, waving his hand in dismissal. Grace guided the man to a booth by the window. Outside, colored lights reflected across the snowy street, casting gentle hues over the tabletop. She tucked her notepad under her arm. "What can I get you, sir?" "Just some soup, if you have it," he murmured, his voice raspy, as though unused for long stretches of silence. "And maybe some water." In the kitchen, Grace ladled out a bowl of potato soup, filling it higher than usual. She reached into the display case for the last gingerbread cookie, iced in red and green. Carrying the tray to his booth, she set the steaming bowl in front of him, placing the cookie carefully on a napkin. "I added this," she explained, a hint of shyness in her tone. "No one should go without something sweet on Christmas Eve." The man's weathered hands curved around the bowl, soaking in its warmth. His cloudy eyes lifted to hers. "This is very kind of you," he said. Grace lowered her gaze. "I don't have much to give," she admitted, "but letting someone go hungry on Christmas, that just wouldn't be right." He ate slowly, savoring each spoonful as if it were a rare treasure. At times his gaze drifted around the diner, sharp despite the years, noticing details most would overlook. The faint crack in the booth's vinyl, the fading tinsel taped too close to the heater. When Grace returned to clear his empty dishes, his eyes fixed on her with unsettling intensity. "You know," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "you look just like someone who once saved my life." Grace froze. "I'm sorry." The old man leaned closer, his words meant only for her. "You are your father's daughter in every way." A chill raced through her. Her father had been gone less than a year, a quiet man, humble, who had rarely spoken about his years in the military. How could this stranger possibly know about him, about her? Before she could form a question, the man slid a carefully folded $5 bill onto the table. It was more than his meal had cost. Rising slowly, he inclined his head with solemn gratitude. "Merry Christmas, Grace Sullivan," he said. Her heart jolted. She had not introduced herself that night. She was not wearing her name tag, yet he spoke her full name with certainty. "If you believe a good person deserves to be remembered, stay here with us," he added, words carrying a weight she could not decipher. Then he turned toward the door, his figure blending into the falling snow. Grace rushed to follow, pushing the door open. The night air bit at her skin, but the street was empty, only a trail of footprints pressed into the fresh snow, proving he had been there at all. She stood for several moments listening to the hush of Christmas Eve before returning to the booth. On the table, beneath the folded bill, she discovered a slip of paper. The handwriting was firm, deliberate. "Thank you for doing the right thing. Some debts take a lifetime to repay." Her fingers trembled as she tucked the note into her apron. Later at home, while stringing tinsel with her mother, she recounted the encounter. "He knew my name, Mom. He said I looked like someone who saved his life. And then he said I'm my father's daughter in every way." Her mother froze, ornament poised midair. "What did he look like?" Grace described the long silver hair, the weathered face, the piercing eyes that seemed to hold decades of stories. "And how old would you say he was?" "Late 70s, maybe early 80s, Grace answered. Her mother slowly lowered herself into a chair, the color draining from her cheeks. "Grace, that matches the description your father gave of his commanding officer, from his service in Germany." Grace's breath caught. Her father had always brushed off questions about his past, saying little beyond that it had been classified. Now, with her mother's words echoing in her ears, she clutched the folded note tighter. The old man's voice still haunted her. "You are your father's daughter in every way." And for the first time, Grace wondered if her father's life held secrets she had never imagined. The snow had melted into slush along the sidewalks by the time Grace returned to the diner for her morning shift 3 days later. Christmas had passed, leaving behind only empty boxes and discarded wrapping paper. But the strange encounter with the old man lingered in her mind like a shadow that refused to fade. She still carried the folded note in her coat pocket, her fingers brushing it absently whenever she felt the ache of questions with no answers. That morning, the diner was unusually quiet. The air smelled of fresh coffee, but the usual hum of conversation was missing. Grace wiped down the counter, her thoughts wandering back to her father, his laugh, his quiet strength, the way he had always managed to make her feel safe even when life around them seemed uncertain. She had spent her whole life believing he had been just an ordinary man, a medic who had served his country and then come home to live quietly. But the words of the stranger, "You are your father's daughter in every way," kept circling in her head. The bell above the door jingled. A man in a dark suit entered, his movements precise, his eyes sweeping across the room with the practiced alertness of someone accustomed to reading environments quickly. He approached the counter where Grace stood. "Grace Sullivan?" His voice was low, professional, yet oddly gentle. "Yes?" She straightened, nerves prickling. "My name is David Mercer. I represent the Veterans Affairs Special Recognition Division. Might I have a word with you in private?" Grace hesitated, glancing toward Joe, who only shrugged, uninterested. Mercer's presence was steady, non-threatening, yet filled with authority. She led him into the small back room, her heart pounding. Once the door closed, Mercer reached into his leather case and produced a worn photograph encased in a protective sleeve. He set it carefully on the table between them. Grace leaned closer, her breath catching. The photo showed 2 men in the mud of a forest clearing. One, a young medic, was dragging a wounded soldier across the ground, determination etched in every line of his face. The medic wore a distinctive red cap beneath his helmet, half hidden under grime. "This was taken in 1972, near the East German border," Mercer explained. "The man in the cap is Private James Sullivan, your father." Grace's hands trembled as she touched the edge of the photograph. She had never seen her father like this. Strong, desperate, fighting against all odds. She had only known him as the quiet man who cooked her pancakes and helped her with math homework. And the man being rescued, Mercer continued, was Colonel Robert Campbell, one of our most valuable intelligence officers during the Cold War. After his recovery, he led several crucial operations before mysteriously disappearing following his retirement in 1989. The official record lists him as missing, presumed deceased. Grace's heart slammed against her ribs. "The man in the diner," Mercer nodded. "We believe it was Colonel Campbell. Facial recognition from your security cameras confirms it. This is the first confirmed sighting in nearly 30 years. Grace pressed her palm against the table to steady herself. But why would he come to see me? Why now? Because of a vow, Mercer said simply. The night your father saved his life, Campbell swore he would always protect the Sullivan family. A life debt. He has been fulfilling it quietly for decades. Grace frowned. That doesn't make sense. We never had money. We lived simply. Mercer opened a folder, spreading documents across the table. Receipts, records, scholarship offers, even medical bills. Do you remember how your father's final hospital stay was covered, despite lapses in insurance? Mercer asked. Grace's breath caught. She remembered. At the time, she and her mother had chalked it up to some anonymous charity fund. Or the scholarship you received to attend community college? It didn't come through the school. It was arranged, paid for by an anonymous benefactor. That benefactor was Colonel Campbell. Grace's vision blurred with tears. Her whole life she had thought luck had stepped in at the hardest moments. But it had been someone watching, someone honoring a promise made long before she was born. Mercer's gaze softened. Colonel Campbell has been monitoring your family from a distance, waiting, protecting, and when your father passed, he must have decided the time had come to reveal himself to you. The room spun with the weight of revelation. Grace thought of the night at the diner, the way he had studied her, the way he had whispered, "You are your father's daughter in every way." It hadn't been a coincidence. Her mother's words came back to her. That description matches your father's commanding officer. A strange mixture of grief, awe, and gratitude surged within her. The kindness she had shown on Christmas Eve had not been a random act to a stranger. It had been part of a circle that had begun decades earlier, when her father had carried a wounded man through enemy fire. Grace pressed the photograph to her chest, whispering, "Dad." And in that moment, she realized her father's life had been far greater than she had ever known. His sacrifice, his bravery, had rippled forward into her own life. And through Campbell, that debt of gratitude still lived, still breathed. Her world would never be the same again. By the end of the week, Grace found herself sitting in the passenger seat of a black government vehicle, its windows tinted, its route winding far beyond the familiar streets of her Idaho town. David Mercer drove without speaking much, his focus steady, his professionalism unshaken. Grace clutched the photograph of her father, the young medic in the red cap dragging his wounded officer through the mud. The image had not left her thoughts since the day Mercer had shown it to her. The car turned down a narrow road that seemed to lead nowhere. Ahead, behind a fence topped with a barbed wire, stood a cluster of gray concrete buildings. They looked plain, almost disappointingly ordinary, but the checkpoints, the armed guards, and the way every vehicle was inspected with precision left no doubt. This was not a place the public was meant to see. Inside, Grace was escorted through security scans and long, sterile hallways until she reached a conference room with no windows, only a single wall screen and a heavy oak table. Waiting there was a man in uniform with silver eagles gleaming on his shoulders. He rose as she entered. "Miss Sullivan," he said with a firm handshake. "I'm Colonel James Whitaker. Thank you for coming." Grace sat opposite him, nerves trembling in her stomach. "Mr. Mercer said you had something classified to tell me." Whitaker nodded. "Yes, and you deserve to know." He activated the wall screen. A map of Cold War-era Germany appeared, dotted with red markings. Your father was not simply a medic. He was attached to a highly specialized reconnaissance unit operating along the Iron Curtain. The night captured in that photograph, the night he saved Colonel Robert Campbell, was not a random skirmish. It was during an operation that prevented a potential nuclear escalation. Grace blinked, struggling to comprehend. "You mean my dad helped stop a war?" "Precisely," Whitaker said. "The details remain sealed even today. But understand this, what he did, the life he saved, altered history." Grace pressed her hand to her lips, tears prickling. Her father, who had never sought recognition, who had only been a quiet, gentle presence at home, he had carried the weight of the world in silence. Whitaker slid a folder across the table. Inside were documents showing financial records, trust accounts, even an obscure insurance policy that had mysteriously covered her father's final hospital bills. Colonel Campbell made a vow that night as your father carried him through hostile territory, despite being wounded himself. He swore he would watch over James Sullivan's family. These documents prove he's kept that vow, funding scholarships, paying bills, ensuring protection where it was needed. Grace's hands shook as she turned page after page. So many moments she had thought of as random luck had been carefully placed acts of guardianship. After your father's death, Whitaker continued, Campbell apparently decided it was time to make one last personal connection, to look into the eyes of James Sullivan's daughter and confirm that his debt had been properly honored. Grace whispered, "But why appear like that? Why pretend to be just some homeless man?" Whitaker's expression softened. Because Campbell still has enemies. For a man who lived in shadows, appearing unremarkable, testing people before revealing himself became second nature. Old habits die hard. At that moment, a young officer entered, whispered something to Whitaker, and quickly departed. Whitaker gave Grace a steady look. "Miss Sullivan, there's someone who would like to speak with you." He tapped the wall screen. The image shifted, and Grace's breath caught. The face that appeared was older, more weathered, yet unmistakable. It was the man from the diner. But now he wore a formal suit, his silver hair neatly combed, his posture commanding. His eyes, still sharp, locked onto hers. "Grace," he said, his voice stronger than she remembered. "I owe you an apology for the theatrics at the diner. But when you've lived the kind of life I have, habits of caution are not easily broken." Her throat tightened. "Colonel Campbell." "Yes," he confirmed. "Your father saved more than just my life that night in '72. The intelligence I carried prevented a military miscalculation that could have triggered open conflict. Millions of lives, Miss Sullivan. That's what your father protected. He never received the recognition because the mission remained classified. But his bravery altered history." Tears blurred Grace's vision. She thought of her father teaching her to fish, fixing her bicycle, humming softly in the evenings. She had never known the full measure of his courage. Campbell's voice grew gentler. "When I saw you offer food to what you thought was just a weary old man on Christmas Eve, without hesitation or judgment, I recognized the same quiet courage, the same instinctive humanity. James Sullivan's legacy lives on in you." Grace pressed her palms to her cheeks, overcome. "There is one more matter," Campbell continued. "The trust fund established for you has matured. It will cover any education you wish to pursue, any path you choose. Your father once told me you dreamed of becoming a doctor. That dream is now within reach." Grace could not speak. Emotion swelled too high in her chest. When the screen went dark, the silence in the room was profound. Whitaker handed her a small box. Inside lay her father's service medal, awarded posthumously, the ribbon gleaming with quiet dignity. Grace wept openly then, clutching the medal as if holding a piece of him once more. For years she had thought of her father as ordinary. Now she understood. He had been extraordinary all along. And the kindness she had shown on Christmas Eve had not been wasted. It had been the spark that unlocked a circle of sacrifice and loyalty, a chain of promises stretching across decades. Her life, she knew, would never be the same. Spring arrived in Idaho with shy blossoms along the roadside, the kind that bloomed briefly before another cold wind returned. For Grace Sullivan, each day carried a new weight of meaning. The folder of documents, the medal, the trust fund, all were proof that her father's legacy stretched far beyond the small apartment they had shared. The memory of Colonel Campbell's voice, steady and commanding, lived inside her. It reminded her of a truth she could no longer deny. A single act of compassion could echo through generations. Not long after, a package arrived at her door. It was wrapped simply, without a return address. Inside lay her father's red medic cap, the very same one from the photograph Mercer had shown her. A single note accompanied it. "From one Sullivan to another, the legacy continues." Grace held the cap to her chest, trembling. For the first time since his passing, she felt her father's presence near, as though he had left her a final blessing. Life began to shift quickly. Grace was offered a role as an ambassador for a Veterans Winter Relief Program, a position that honored her father's service while allowing her the freedom to pursue medical school. The scholarship fund Campbell had nurtured for decades now gave her a path she had once believed impossible. And in quiet moments, she understood. This was not charity. It was the fulfillment of a vow, a circle of kindness completed. When Christmas Eve returned the following year, the diner no longer stood empty. Grace was not behind the counter in a waitress's apron. She was the sponsor of a new tradition, a free Christmas dinner for veterans, widows, and anyone who would otherwise spend the night alone. Warmth filled the room, the air alive with the hum of voices and clinking silverware. Families, strangers, and soldiers sat shoulder to shoulder, sharing food and laughter. At the center of it all stood a table kept empty, the Sullivan table. On it rested a framed photograph of her father, his steady eyes captured in a rare, candid smile. Beside it lay the red medic cap, positioned with reverence, as if its invisible owner still watched over the room. Grace moved among the tables, ensuring every guest had enough to eat. Her heart swelled at the sight of veterans in worn jackets sharing stories with children, of widows laughing softly over pie, of travelers finding company in strangers. Then a young boy hovered near the Sullivan table. His clothes were too small, his eyes uncertain. Grace knelt beside him. "Would you like to sit here?" She asked gently. The boy looked at the photograph, then at her. Was he a soldier? Grace's throat tightened. He was a healer, she said softly, someone who helped people when they needed it most. The boy nodded, sliding into the chair with quiet reverence. Grace smiled, seeing her father's spirit ripple outward once again, one more soul folded into the circle. As the evening wore on, the diner glowed with a warmth no storm could dim. The bell above the door chimed, and David Mercer entered. He nodded respectfully, pressing a small envelope into Grace's hand before moving on. She opened it later, beneath the soft glow of the Christmas lights. Inside was a single message, written in familiar handwriting. The circle continues. Well done. Her heart caught. Perhaps Campbell was somewhere nearby, watching quietly. Or perhaps it was only his legacy speaking now, carried forward by those who understood the value of a promise kept. Either way, Grace knew it did not matter. What mattered was the truth she had come to embrace. That kindness never disappears. It waits, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades, until the right moment brings it back again. She stood in the middle of the diner, listening to the laughter, the clinking of plates, the hum of strangers becoming family. Snow fell softly outside the windows, blanketing the world in silence. Grace touched the red medic cap with tender fingers, her voice a whisper meant for her father and for all who had walked this path before her. No one should face the darkness alone. And in that moment, the legacy was alive, not only in her, but in everyone gathered there. The circle had widened. The promise had been kept. Some gifts don't come wrapped in paper. Some are carried in the small acts, a bowl of soup, a gingerbread cookie, a seat at a table. Yet these gifts are powerful enough to change lives, to span decades, to heal wounds deeper than any scar. Grace looked at the boy sitting at the Sullivan table, then at the veterans raising their glasses in quiet toasts. She smiled, certain of one thing her father would have approved. And so the circle of kindness continued, one Christmas Eve at a time, a story of sacrifice, love, and humanity that would never be forgotten. Some stories remind us that even the smallest act, a kind word, a warm meal, can ripple outward and shape the future. Grace Sullivan's journey proves that kindness never vanishes. It returns, often in ways we cannot imagine. If you believe in the power of compassion, share the story, leave a comment, and remember, kindness, however small, is always worth passing on.